Hi, Pastor Adam here, and this week we are continuing on our study of Joseph. This week we're looking at how he understood and used his power and authority, how he used it in a godly and righteous way to bring restoration to his family and God's people. If that sounds like something you might be interested in, check out the sermon. Good morning. We are continuing our November arc into Joseph. We got today and next week, we got 2 more weeks left to do this before we start our debrief of 2023. So just a quick recap, we started by reevaluating the Joseph narrative overall and how God was using Joseph to bring forth his plan in Christ, and how Joseph was especially receptive to his role in that, having an understanding of God's providence and sovereignty, which enabled Joseph to kind of endure everything that he's gone through. As I said last week and the week before in cell group, Joseph didn't sort of cash in on his position and power and authority and perceived blessing that he had garnered up to this, high point in his life. He didn't cash in on that. He didn't sell short how God might be using him, the role that he would play. So he vigilantly was committed to a bigger role that God wanted him for. And so we talked about that in the first week. And then last week we talked about Joseph's brand of forgiveness. Wow, it's a lot quieter with that thing off. Forgiveness with a purpose is what we were talking about last week. One that wants reconciliation. One that hopes for the future. Joseph forgave in a way that looks nothing like what we see in culture today, and we talked about that. We talked about the different ways in which forgiveness is used, misused, how forgiveness is actually unforgiving in the culture that we live in today. How it's, there's a cucumber on the carpet here.
Mine fell on my feet.
I'm going to kick it back your way. That didn't work. I was going to say, it doesn't start there. But Joseph's brand of forgiveness, it's radically different than what we see in society today, where it still wants to hold on to something, still wants to hold bitterness, still wants to ultimately punish, and how that's unforgiving, unloving. Joseph forgives in order to actually restore, to reconcile the relationships between him and his family, his brothers, his father's legacy. And so this week we're going to look at Joseph's use, his understanding, his view of power and authority, because he had much of it. And I believe it was Joseph's understanding of who he was before or for God that put him in a proper headspace to be able to discern, to implement, and to use his power to bring about exactly what we were talking about last week in that restorative forgiveness. To use the power and authority that God had led him to in his life in order to execute on arguably his greatest moment in that Genesis chapter 45 moment that we were honing in on last week. So again, understanding first the greater overall picture that Joseph's story wasn't his own, right? That it was Jacob's story that he was preserving, which enabled him to understand God's sovereignty, God's providence, and which would ultimately lead him to his instrumental role in that forgiveness that we talked about last week, preserving this idea of land, seed, and covenant that we talked about in the first week. I kind of mentioned that we're going like a little non-linear, we're kind of moving backwards at this point, right? We talked about chapter 45, his forgiveness of his brothers, that moment. We're going to go backwards again this week. The thing that led him to that, to be able to do that. So hopefully you're seeing sort of a common thread in what's connecting these ideas this month. But the chapters leading up to this forgiveness moment, if you will, chapter 42, 43, 44, 41 actually, 42, 43, 44, gives us our context for what I want to try to highlight today. Because of time, I don't want to just sit here and narrate the whole arc in 3-4 chapters for you, just recite it. So because of that, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you my recap. A lot of you know the story of Joseph. So I'll summarize where he's at this point, and I'll make the point for today, and Joseph's use and understanding of power and authority and how it led him to where he was in that chapter 45. So obviously, by this point in the story, chapter 42, 43, 44, again, it's a big story in Scripture. It's a lot of space is reserved for Joseph's arc. But at this point in the story, he's already got this position, this power, this authority. He's already interpreted the dream of Pharaoh, right? And because of this, Pharaoh puts him as his right hand. He puts him as like practically the most powerful person like in the world, right? In this empire of Egypt. We've talked about that. He's interpreted the dream that predicted the famine, years of plenty followed by years of nothing, years of famine. And that time has come now, the years of nothing. So the years of plenty have happened, now come the years of nothing. And we read in chapter 42 at verse 46, chapter 41 at verse 46, he was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So 17 is when he was sold into slavery, thrown in the pit, right? Traders come and picked him up, took him to Potiphar. Now he's 30, so 13 years has passed. He was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. And as predicted, for 7 years the land produced bumper crops. And during those years, Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain from the surrounding fields in the cities. Skipping ahead to verse 53 of chapter 41. At last, the 7 years of bumper crops throughout the land of Egypt came to an end. And then the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. The famine also struck all the surrounding countries, but throughout Egypt there was plenty of food. Eventually, however, the famine spread through the land of Egypt as well. And when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, he told them, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." So with severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain, and Joseph, because the famine was severe throughout the world. Again, this is chapter 41, the end of it. Then comes chapter 42. It begins with Jacob, Joseph's father, Jacob, sending his 10 older sons to Egypt. And we get to see how the reunion begins to unfold here, how it begins to unfold before we were at that moment we were at last week. And it unfolds, as I mentioned before, with Joseph putting his brothers through this series of tests, right? The series of tests which would inform Joseph of the people that they had become over the last 13 or so years. Have they changed? Have they not? Has their wickedness and deception evolved? In general, what's become of his family? Is dad alive? Is little bro alive? These are the questions that Joseph opens up when he's reunited, when he's face to face finally at last with those brothers. And remember, there's no recognition of who each other is at this point, right? Joseph looks a lot different. He looks like an Egyptian. He's got clothes like an Egyptian. Probably doesn't have an awesome Hebrew beard, right? Does have jewelry on. He was given the ring by the Pharaoh. Speaks a different language. So there's no recognition of who each other is at this point. All of these things he's asking in this reunion, in this first confrontation with his brothers, all of these things while keeping his identity a secret. He's even speaking through an interpreter to maintain this illusion, right? He's not speaking their language. And so he truly looks like a strange foreign ruler to his brothers. Remember what I said in week 1. Joseph at this point is serving in the wrong house. He's got the wrong family. He's wearing the wrong clothing, wrong identity, wrong family, wrong everything. This is where Joseph's at. Chapter 42, verse 7. Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where are you from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied. "We have come to buy food." And although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And he remembered the dreams he'd had about them many years before. So you have to appreciate the position that Joseph is in at this point. What he must be thinking. all this power and authority that he has now. And lo and behold, look who's standing in front of him. A lesser person, a less righteous person operating without God, would no doubt want to take that opportunity to get back, right? To exercise their power and authority in a way that punishes, like we kind of talked about last week. A lesser person would want to get back at those backstabbing betrayers. Surely this must have been the opportunity to execute on the vision God had given to him, right? God said that you're going to rule over these guys. They're going to bow down to you. Look where we are in the story now. It's exactly what's happening. They're coming before him. If Joseph had been dominated by bitterness and hatred, he could have viewed the dream at this point as a mandate. Rule over them. Be harsh to them. Hadn't God revealed to him that his brothers would bow down? He could have rubbed their noses in it if he wanted to. So this was the position. This is what we have to appreciate about the position he's in at this point. It's kind of a looky who we have here kind of moment in the story. And he begins this series of tests on his brothers, on his 10 brothers, with this sort of feigned severity, with meaning like artificial harshness toward his brothers, so that he can test them, so that he can see who they've become, right? He wants to kind of put them through their paces. I want to make a quick digression, a quick note before I go on something I said last week that as I thought about it this week, as I was thinking more about it last night, I think I might have spoken more definitively on than maybe I'm comfortable with now. Last week I said that Joseph's brothers were never actually repentant toward him. And as I was thinking about it, I think that might have been maybe overly harsh, at least too definitive. Because I do think you see some sort of semblance of repentance within the text of chapter 42 and 43 at this part of the story. I think it might be still up for interpretation, but I think the dialogue that his brothers have with each other might indicate that they're starting to reevaluate the decisions they made so many years before. So I don't think I could comfortably say they weren't at least somewhat repentant. It says in verse 21 of chapter 42, speaking among themselves, they said, clearly we are being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw this anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why we're in trouble. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? Reuben asked. But you wouldn't listen, and now we have to answer for his blood. Of course, they didn't know that Joseph understood them, for he'd been speaking to them through an interpreter. The relationship between their present predicament and their treatment of Joseph was too obvious for them to overlook, and it forced them to come face to face with that. Each of them acknowledging that their difficulties at present time was the result of their sin toward their brother. They had pled for mercy, and they had not received it. Same as Joseph had cried for help in the pit, but they ignored him. And Reuben reminded them of the warnings and their resistance. Sin has brought forth their sin has brought forth their consequences. They're beginning to realize how painful these might be for them. So that's why I say at the very least it's worth reading and considering for yourselves how you want to interpret that. Obviously only God knows how fully repentant they were, either in that moment or fast forwarding toward the end of their father's life when they're reevaluating where they stand with Joseph, and that's where I was standing on last week. I don't know. Maybe it's too harsh to say they weren't at the beginning stages of repentance. Ultimately, we don't know. It doesn't say how fully repentant they were, but clearly they've come face to face with their sin, and they have to be brought back before God in that way. But continuing on, the story goes on for the rest of chapter 42. and on to chapter 43 and 44, with Joseph laying down these harsh demands and expectations for his brothers so they can prove their sincerity, that they're not, spies, that they're not trying to come and plunder Egypt, so on and so forth, so he can observe their character. Demands which begin like high and harsh, Joseph to his brothers, but gradually, through Joseph's goodness and his mercy, demands that decrease over time, right? In the story, it starts with Joseph saying, all of you are going to stay in prison here, and one of you is going to go and fetch your brother, your younger brother, Benjamin. And they're like, oh, our father, what's that going to do to us? What's that going to do to the family? Eventually, this goes to one of you will stay, and the rest of you will fetch your brother. So this is why I say Joseph is feigning this harshness and severity to test them. But demands start high, and it's through Joseph's goodness and mercy that they kind of decrease over time. Grain and money returned to their sacks, as the story goes on to say, testing their integrity. Are they going to return the money? Joseph gave them this grain for free. They're feeling like, oh, how's that gonna look? What's the optics of this? So he was putting them through this series of tests to see where his brothers are at. And these tests, the brothers journey back and forth from Canaan to Egypt, and Egypt to Canaan, and then Canaan back to Egypt again. They provide insight into Joseph's own understanding and use of his power and authority. But before we can understand how Joseph was able to handle this, how he was able to handle this position of power in a way that honored God and blessed his family ultimately, we have to understand some principles regarding power. And so I have some of those. The first principle of power and authority that we need to understand, and that Joseph understood, is that it's stewardship, right? Power we hold, power that Joseph held, is legitimate power. If it's legitimate power, then it's power that's given by God. The creation account all that's been created. They will govern it, reign over the fish in the sea, and so on. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 28. And Paul echoes this sentiment in Romans chapter 13. Everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority placed there by God. Jesus, of course, says the same thing to Pilate. When Pilate is talking to Jesus, and he's basically, I don't know what to call it a threat, but leveraging his power and authority to try to get a response from Jesus. And Jesus says in John 11, you would have no power over me at all unless you were given to you from above. So Joseph, at this point, well aware, I think we can conclude, Joseph well aware that the power he had was given to him by God. In chapter 41, for example, the Pharaoh says, oh, Joseph, you can do this. Oh, wow, you can do this. And Joseph is quick to point out that this ability to execute on interpreting those dreams was not his own. It doesn't come from his own ability, his own power, his own authority. He's not so miraculous, but it's from his God. So the first step step toward pride would be to fail to recognize this. The first step toward misusing power is failing to recognize who it ultimately comes from, who we have to answer to. Joseph knew this. A second principle is that power and authority should be used to serve others. In Ezekiel, I liked this scripture, in Ezekiel chapter 34, the prophet rebukes Israel's leaders for failing in this regard, for losing sight of their purpose and using their power to ultimately serve themselves. Ezekiel 34. Then, starting at verse 1, then this message came to me from the Lord. This is the prophet speaking. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds, the leaders of Israel. Give them this message from the sovereign Lord. What sorrow awaits you, shepherds, who feed yourselves instead of your flocks? Shouldn't shepherds feed their sheep? You drink the milk, you wear the wool, and butcher the best animals, but you let your flocks starve. You have not taken care of the weak. You have not tended to the sick and bound up or injured. You have not gone looking for those who have wandered away and are lost. Instead, you rule over them with harshness and cruelty. So my sheep have been scattered without a shepherd. They are easy prey for a wild animal. They have wandered through all the mountains and all the hills across the face of the earth, that no one goes to search for them. This is a rebuke on the Israelite leaders from the prophet, that these guys lost sight of the authority that they were given. Jesus rebukes the Pharisees in a similar fashion in Matthew chapter 23. Pharisees crush people with unbearable religious demands, never lifting a finger to ease the burden. But he says the greatest among you, skipping forward in that chapter, the greatest among you must serve. But those exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves exalted. And he says something similar about himself in Mark chapter 10, that he came not to be served, but to serve. Famous scripture. So as Joseph is sitting there in that moment of reunion with his brothers, and as he recalls his dreams, remember it says that he's remembering those dreams. Here I am now. Here they are now. I'm remembering this dream. Surely he must have realized in that moment that everything leading to it, his suffering, his torment, his abandonment, all of that, but now also his power and authority, God ordained. He's sitting there not to satisfy himself, but for restorative purpose. This is what leads him to chapter 45, to be able to do that, to save the nation of Israel from physical death, from famine, from spiritual decay. So he ultimately gives this grain freely for his brothers to take back. This is power and authority in the hands of someone who's in a position to serve rather than to be served. A proper meekness. Joseph was properly meek in his power and authority. Another principle is that power is obtained and used in kind of a lot of different ways, and we need to understand the ways in which it plays out. So I have some of those as I was thinking about it. It plays out positionally. Positionally, power is obtained positionally, which means it comes through office. For example, like jobs and employment status, right? An employer over an employee. So that's a positional power. A sergeant to a private, a parent to a kid. It doesn't speak to the quality or value of a person. It just is what it is, right? Positional power. Joseph had this. Joseph had positional power by virtue of his political office that the Pharaoh put him in. Second in command, accountable only to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do it. Joseph's given positional power. So he understands that. He understands the weight of that. Power comes situationally. Joseph also finds himself in this position of power. It's circumstantial by nature. It's kind of a supply and demand type of power, right? I have something you need, so that puts me in a position of power over you. He was second in command to Pharaoh, but his brothers were not under his authority technically, but because of the circumstance, because of the situation, if you will, Joseph has power over these people, right? They're not Egyptians. They're Hebrews. They're from a different area altogether, in the land of Canaan. But because of the situation, Joseph has power and authority over them. It puts him in a position to go one of two ways, to use that power and authority one of two ways. His brothers at this point have no alternative, so they're at the whim of Joseph. In the wrong hands, obviously we can see how this is used improperly. Becomes manipulative, becomes sinful, accomplishes selfish desire. It's interesting that even in the Old Testament Levitical laws, like when it's talking about lending money and borrowing from a brother and being in debts and stuff like this, even in the Old Testament Levitical laws, those things had checks and balances in place to where someone couldn't be taken advantage of because of their position, because of their circumstances of their life, right? It talks about after X amount of years, you wipe the debt free. You don't charge interest on a fellow brother. So even in the Old Testament laws, there was checks and balances in place to combat a misuse of circumstantial or situational power. So Joseph is positionally in a positionally the deck in all these ways in which Joseph really has them, right? Expertly. Power comes through expertise. This is somewhat more pragmatic by definition, based on performance. You know, few people ask a mechanic where they went to school before they get their car fixed. That's not a thing, right? Especially mechanics. That's sort of on-the-job learning, right? They just want to know, can you fix it? Can you do the job? Does your expertise lend toward that? Same thing with medicine, you know. I don't think most people ask where a doctor went to medical school. Like, can you diagnose and treat my problem? Can you fix it? Do you have the expertise? Pharaoh didn't really care about Joseph's past, his prison record, his nationality. Can you do the job for me? Can you interpret the dream? So Joseph could. Joseph had the expertise. Beyond his ability to do that, you know, he comes to Pharaoh with a plan for how to handle that dream, how to handle that famine, because of his expert power. So Pharaoh was right to place Joseph in this position. So there's another layer of Joseph's power and authority, where you can start to see, without a proper understanding and context for where he was in life, answering to someone bigger than himself, all these things can start to get away from you pretty quick in terms of how you use and appropriate these different aspects of power and authority. We've definitely seen expertise, this type of expert power, if I'm going to call it that, misused in the last few years. Talking about trust the science and whatnot. Whatever. Then there's psychological power. And definitely in the point of the story that we're at, chapter 42, 43, 44, Joseph, he has them psychologically. Consider the circumstances from the story. Joseph had an incredible amount of power. Here they are, foreigners in this land. Hebrew shepherds, they couldn't speak the language. They weren't actually like the Egyptians, men from a different country, from the country. Now they're in this sort of big city. The pomp and circumstance of their surroundings, and Joseph's feigned harshness on them, you know, like, as I said, like it's forcing them to confront their sin, right? So psychologically, Joseph is doing work here. He has psychological power over his brothers, where improperly used can really destroy a relationship, really create an unhealthy relationship. They were like putty in his hands at this point. And then there's power that just rewards or punishes. You know, Joseph could go one of two ways here. Imprison, crush, rule over his brothers, make them pay, or reward and bless them. And even before this forgiveness, this sort of pinnacle moment in chapter 45 we were talking about last week, even before that ultimate reward and restoration and all that, we see Joseph like taking the path of blessing his brothers, right? Putting grain in their sacks, returning the money to their sacks. Another way in which Joseph has a proper, godly, righteous understanding of his power and authority. All of these things I'm talking about, all these types of principles of power, if you will, they can be used to the glory of God, but they're secular in nature, right? Psychological power, expert power, this and that. They're secular in nature. Sorry, my tablet just jumped on me. So what does a different type of power look like? If these are all secular, what type of power does Joseph employ, really? How does he take all these principles of power and apply a godly, righteous, spiritual lens to them? That's the question. How does Joseph glorify God in his use and understanding of power and authority? He displays it for us, but first we have to understand that this different type of power and authority, spiritually speaking, it's power and authority that understands its source. Talked about that at the top. Its source, God, the creator and sustainer of all things, God who gives authority, God who puts people in position, God's providence, God's sovereignty, all these things. A spiritual understanding of power recognizes its source. And this type of power and authority, spiritually speaking, is inconsistent with human devices and manipulative techniques. Paul's words at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 2 says this: "When I first came to you, dear brothers and sisters, I didn't use lofty words, impressive wisdom to tell you God's secret plan. I decided that while I was with you, I would forget everything except for Jesus Christ, the one who was crucified. I came to you in weakness, timid and trembling. And my message and my preaching was very plain. Rather than using clever and persuasive speeches, I relied on the power of the Spirit to inform my words," is what he's saying. Paul wasn't being manipulative. Paul understood who he was before God. Paul understood his power comes from the Spirit of God. Understanding this power is knowing that it isn't given to people who are humanly capable and confident, like Paul was just saying, but to people who are weak and dependent on God, who fall back on God. Isaiah chapter 40 says, verse 29, he gives power to the weak, strength to the powerless. Youth will become weak and tired, and young men will fall into exhaustion, but those who trust in the Lord find new strength. It's the same power that has divine enablement to save, to keep, to sanctify, to restore, to defeat death. It's this type of spiritual understanding of power and authority of and from God that enables authority that produces spiritual results. And we see that in the relationship between Joseph and his family. I've talked about it, at least in cell group, that it's hard not to think Joseph's temptation would have been to fall on a secular understanding of where he was at this point in his life. And as his brothers stand before him in great need, it's hard not to think about the temptation that might have come with that. But it was Joseph's spiritual power which yielded the greatest results. His spiritual understanding of power, rather. He feigned an inappropriate psychological power just to test where his brothers might have been at. But it was his grace and mercy, his spiritual understanding of his power, the ability to be gracious, to be merciful, that began to wake these guys up. That's kind of why I backtracked a little bit, because I think it's the way Joseph conducted himself and used his power. I think it might have actually started to wake these guys up. So you start to see the spiritual results of his understanding of power. It was grace that caused his brothers to consider their circumstances as coming from God, surely, in their dialogue with each other. That's what they're saying. It was only after Joseph released his brothers from prison and relaxed these once harsh demands on them and offered hope and life by assuring them that he too fears God. It says this in chapter 42, verse 18. That they began to consider their dilemma before the brother they sinned against. Again, not knowing that he's standing in front of them, against ultimately the God that they sinned against. And it was after they realized that that money had miraculously ended up back in their sacks that they're asking themselves, what is this that God has done to us? Again, they're confronted with their sin. It's what awakened them to the sin committed against Joseph. And this selfless spirit of Joseph is in contrast with the self-seeking spirit of Jacob and his 10 sons. Joseph could have never expected to see his brothers again. Could have never expected to see his brothers and his relationship with his brothers restored and reconciled had he used secular methods of exercising his power and authority, motivated by selfish desire. I want to make them pay. I want to judge them. Human power, a human understanding, a secular understanding, a selfish understanding, motivated by human understanding, sinful understanding, brings about just that, sinful results. But godly agency, understanding power and authority through that lens, through a spiritual lens, through a lens that wants to please God, through a lens that wants to demonstrate God's good character, produces spiritual ends. And that's what we see in the story of Joseph and the relationship with his family, the restoring of the covenant, the preserving of the covenant, rather. So then the question for us becomes, how do we exercise our power and authority? Obviously, none of us are second in command of Egypt or the United States or whatever. But we all have influence in some aspect of our life, as I look around the room. As fathers, as our authority secular in nature, are we imposing psychological power to get our kids to submit? Or, are we, psychological power to get our kids to submit to us? Or are we employing spiritual means? Do we misuse and embitter our spouse because of our positional authority? After all, God does set up the economy in the household there. But is it misused, misappropriated? Does it produce unrighteous results in our lives by the way that we're employing that power? Are we serving only our own interests? At work, we're managers. There's some of us in management here. What does that management look like for us to our employees? How do we exercise a more righteous type of authority, one that demonstrates God, one that reflects his character? What brand of authority do we exercise on people? In analyzing who Joseph was, how he conducted himself, the question is posed, what do we do with the power at our disposal? Do we use it to serve others? Or do we use our power to get what we want? To only get what we seek? Scripture says that, people in these positions, they have a responsibility to serve others. Do we use our power and authority to grow relationships, to restore relationships? To demonstrate real love for those around us, under us, to glorify God? Or have we resorted to secular power to achieve our goals, even godly goals? Do we use secular power toward those ends because we're more accustomed to it? Joseph's vigilance and his agency as being a tool for God understood he was there for a purpose, to serve, to restore, using this power and authority, having a proper understanding of how to implement it. And that's what ultimately led to that 45th chapter that we read last week. So I have questions, just 3. Although I was tempted to really rattle off questions, Colin. Colin always calls me out for that. How do you see authority used in your life? And what's the fruit of it? How do you see authority used in your life? So thinking about the different, areas of your life, whether at work, at school, at church, wherever, at home. How do you see authority used, and what's the fruit of it? So reflect on that. Second question, kind of like the question from last week that I asked when I was talking about forgiveness, but what purpose does your power and authority serve? What's its goal? What purpose does your power and authority serve? And last question, what specific trait would you want to make sure to include when you step into a position of authority? Maybe some of you are like, I'm not really in a position of power or authority over anyone. So think about what brand of authority you want to extend, to exercise. What do you want to make sure you do with that? What specific trait do you want your power and authority, even if it's later in life, to have? All right. There's the questions. Let's go talk about this.